land reform is the most pressing thing that is required for the development, further development of agriculture. And this is, and I think it's going to be, I think it will inevitably happen. Actually, because when you look at the small land holdings, if you look at the small land holding that exists, the incomes that come from them are negligible. And in fact, the non-agricultural incomes in many of these places is much more significant than incomes for agriculture. People hang on to these small land holdings as social insurance scheme, because if everything fails, at least I can come back. But if you travel around, I traveled from Lviv, I mean, I was active in Sambir at one point, from Sambir to the Polish border, and as somebody who comes from Central Asia, where in the Pamirs, which is 48% of the territory of Tajikistan, there's 15,000 hectares of arable land. And I looked at this place in Western Ukraine, and you wanted to cry. And why aren't people doing anything? Because Mama is working from Italy, and she's sending 100 euros. And nobody is doing anything, but they're hanging on to the land. I think what you've raised is the most important thing, and I think that's going to come. Simply because it's not sustainable from that point of view. The employment in agriculture now, in its flourishing sectors, is simply overwhelmingly more attractive than hanging on to these small producers. You should not equate civil society with NGOs, because that is a very specific form of civil society, which is generally very often dependent on external grants. На русском языке это грантоеды, right? And in Kyrgyzstan, their level, the population of trust of the population in NGOs is just a little bit below the militia. But Kyrgyzstan, if you look at the world rankings, is 14th in the world in volunteering. What is the strength of civil society in Ukraine is that it's much greater than NGOs. It's the volunteer movement. Now, and so I would talk about the civil society sector. I think it's incredibly imaginative, and and the beauty of its imagination, it's not just focused on government policy. There are wonderful things happening in the arts, in cinema, all over the place in environmental movements. I think that the civil society sector is doing an excellent job of monitoring. I think it almost is doing too good a job, because any of you who watch Ukrainian television, I mean, 50% of the news is on corruption and who's been arrested and who got off and who occupied which court. And it's a very tricky thing, this whole business of corruption, because the overwhelming perception is, if I asked everybody over here, Ukraine is corrupt, right? Everybody would pick up their hands. But then when you ask people, and what is your specific experience of corruption? Only 10% of Ukrainian citizens have an experience of corruption. So I think the effective fight against corruption has to be more granular. And you've got to pick on those guys who steal from the public purse and not to do these kinds of general things. But I think that this is wonderful to see this aggressive fight against corruption. And I hope that one of these days it's going to work. I think one of the things that has to happen is that this activity has to be professionalized. Not what I mean by professionalized is it has to become more granular and better informed, and there has to be a deeper understanding that it's not just good enough to say we needed educational reform and the current Minister of Education is bad. You have to sit down and actually figure out how you would do this education reform, at what cost, and this sort of thing. I happen to be involved with a small policy center called Anna Yaroslavna Policy Center. That is actually a policy centers for these kinds of groups that do very good work on the environment and this sort of thing, but don't know how to package it and how to present it to government, and we're helping them do this. I think this is very important. And this is, when you go to Ukraine, this is the inspiration. I mean, everybody goes there and just flabbergasted by the creativity of youth in every sector. That's the beautiful thing, is that it goes in every sector. Where do political parties come from? Political parties come from because they represent interests. Well, actually, in Ukraine, you don't really have political parties. And some political parties, I am pretty certain, are externally funded, and I don't want to make the list, but you can imagine. So if I wanted to upset Ukraine, I would have a bunch of extreme right-wing nutcases parading around in an imitation of the Nuremberg parade, right? And nobody knows where these guys get funding from. It's interesting. I think the time is going to come when something is going to happen. You know, Ukraine is a funny society. The most popular politician is an Afghan refugee. And somebody asked me, are you pluralistic? I said, well, you know, pretty pluralistic. And nobody actually pays attention to the fact that this guy is an Afghan refugee. Right? So this comes the difficult part, what you mentioned. And I think it's going to take a fair amount of work and more professionalization. I meet various people in Ukraine, and I think there's a little bit of hope. One of the things is that people in the agrarian party are kind of waking up and, you know, realizing, my God, we're the biggest exporter. We employ 15% of the population. We need a voice. But they have to also develop a more general agenda for the common good. I don't know. I just hope, because the last thing we need is another round of what it is that we have. I think the Russian influence in Ukraine is massive. I think that there is a sector of the elite that is comprador. And remember when I talked about models of development, the rent seekers versus the guys where the country becomes rich because of entrepreneurial activity? Well, there is a certain sector of the a comprador ruling class that depends on somebody else out there. And so the fight to them has to be taken in two ways. One is an economic fight through economic development and making life extremely difficult for them, and also exposing them for what they are. I think that I think that Russian influence is not just them. I would look very careful at some of the most extreme right-wing nationalist parties to find out their sources of origin. This is what they fund in Western Europe. It is like a safe bet to do this in Ukraine, because you have to show that there are Nazis. And if there aren't any, you have to try to invent a couple. So I think it's a very seditious influence. Media, however, is not important. And what's interesting, I almost think that it goes a little bit far, but in any case. But the extent to which everybody that is young simply ignores what happens in Russia. I know that my youngest daughter's generation, they absolutely couldn't care less, and they don't set foot over there. Russian media is not present. That is the extent of European choice, what I talked about, as a civilizational option. The extent of the clear light at the end of the tunnel. Just think of our Ukrainian history. How many times we failed because there was no organizing idea of society. When I heard that European Parliament Commission or something like that voted in favor to give visa-free regimes, I told somebody, there goes 10% of the pro-Ukrainian vote in Donetsk. You can have your LNR and DNR passports, and maybe you can get into Russia. You won't get anywhere else. The more that happens and becomes a model of society, and I think that's the secret about Crimea. One of the things that one should have is patience. I'm not talking patience on the Chinese scale when Zhou Enlai was asked, what do you think of the French Revolution? And he said it's too early to tell. But just have patience, because the situation in Russia is unstable. The more, as a general rule, the more authoritarian you are, the more restrictive you are, is not an indication of stability and strength, it's an indication of weakness. It means that you can only maintain control by repression. That's been tried, and everywhere it has a certain, expiry date. And that expiry date is happening. In my part of the world, I happen to watch quite closely what is going on in Russia, and just listen to what's coming out of Tatarstan complaints and this sort of thing. There are very many unhappy people. I think that, and there are also elites that have been pushed out, people who used to own businesses that have been taken over by Putin's guys from the KGB, who have been put in charge of these companies and are going to drive these companies into the ground. They're simply going to drive them into the ground because they're not entrepreneurs, they're rent seekers. The number of small and medium enterprises in Russia has declined over the last couple of years. It's a worse situation than in Ukraine. So the combination of potential changes in Russia and a very good model for Ukraine means that there could be a negotiated settlement down the road in Crimea. Let's have patience. Well, I think it's sort of odd that the Russian sphere of influence and the big empire is now kind of reduced to firming up, its influence in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. I mean, Lukashenko is not exactly a big fan of Putin these days either. The influence there is very significant, and it has very much to do with the dreadful economic situation in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, where 50% of the GDP of Tajikistan is through remittances of labor migrants in Russia. And 38% of GDP in Kyrgyzstan is from labor migrants. So in Tajikistan, the failure to do any kind of, it's an authoritarian regime run by Rahmon, who has now declared himself president for life. The main economic policy is to export your people. That's a very dreadful thing. There was a very, very sad opinion poll done of students that said, what is your career ambition? And 85% was to get the hell out of the country. So in any case, the Russians are giving money there, and they play an important role. But please understand that next door is China, and the biggest investor is China. So the Eurasian Customs Union was a political project. Its economic consequences that we have studied carefully are not very good for countries like Kyrgyzstan, where the whole point was we joined the customs union in order to diversify. And because the customs union is controlled by Russia and it makes the rules, Kyrgyz exports joining the customs union that will facilitate exports to diversify fell by 35%. Kazakhstan is in a very different category. This is a country and a leader that has done a highly successful nation-building exercise. And it's true there's a little bit of money on the side for the family. But he sort of patterns himself after Ataturk. There's one difference: Ataturk died poor. But in the meantime, just look at the TIM score, these international tests for math and science. Kazakhstan is within the top 10 in the world. They're very, very, very smart people, and they want to become globally competitive with global brains. And believe me, they're not looking to China for a to Russia for a civilizational model or patterns of education. They're introducing grade 12, starting 5 years from now. or 3 years from now, grade 12 science subjects are going to be taught in English. And the minister,
Russian.
what?
Not Russian?
Well, no, they're virtually, no. It's Kazakh. Well, you'll learn Russian as a language, English. And Nazarbayev's policy, very correctly, is trilingual. The progress that has been made on making Kazakh as a national language is absolutely phenomenal. The achievement is that a recent public opinion poll showed that the identification of Kazakhstanians is the same amongst Russians and Ukrainians living in Kazakhstan as it is amongst Kazakhs. There's a very strong imprint of, I am a citizen of this country and not going anywhere. That is a massive achievement. Kazakhstan is a place to watch. That after volunteerism, the second most trusted institution are churches. And it's a place of solace, and it's also volunteer society, only of a different form. But I don't understand the sort of, the deeper roots of this business. I haven't looked at it in detail, except for I know what that fact is. In terms of, I know a little bit more about what's going on in our part of the world, in our part of the world, in Central Asia, and I think one has to be very careful. It grabs the headlines, right? 7 Kyrgyz were in the Islamic State, and as if this is a sort of broader thing. Actually, the mosque attendance in Kyrgyzstan hasn't gone up particularly, but I suspect probably the same sort of thing is going on in Kyrgyzstan as in Ukraine, is that the church is not just a question of ritual and theology, but it's also the message that the church gives. Like love your neighbor, be good to each other, and also in an ethical vacuum. This is a place that actually is sends the right messages, and this is a very big challenge for the churches to raise to the occasion. These countries, Tajikistan's a bit of an exception, but where you have very significant social problems and a kind of marginalized youth, they tend to gravitate to a certain strand of Islam as a social protest. It's not really a religious conversion. Now, you have agents of Russia. There you have colossal agents of the Wahhabis and the Salafists coming from the Gulf and things like that just pour tons of money. And for many people, it's actually good to be an Islamic militant because you get $400 a month. And what's very interesting, I saw a study in Kyrgyzstan, the crime guys, the criminals have really gotten into the act. They now control mosques and the flow of money. So, if that's the kind of social reality, and this is actually very widespread, I really think it's really bound up with the question of sort of socio-economic issues more than anything else.